Okay, so you shared some sources this time that uh, really threw me into a pretty intense corner of the internet, this whole area called the manosphere.
Right. It's definitely a space that gets talked about.
Yeah, and terms like red pill, misogyny, alpha male, you hear them, but honestly, do most people really know what they mean, where they came from?
Probably not the full story, no. There's often a lot of confusion or just partial understanding.
Exactly. So I think that's our mission for this deep dive.
Yeah.
Really unpack these terms, their origins, the debates, all within that manosphere context.
Makes sense. Because it's not just one thing, is it?
No, the sources describe it as like all these different online communities, forums, blogs, whatever, focusing on men's issues, dating, masculinity.
Gender dynamics, yeah. And it's a real mix. Some parts seem aimed at self-improvement, but then there's also some pretty, well, extreme stuff in there, too.
Definitely. So let's try and define the territory first. What exactly is the manosphere? You said it's not just one place.
That's the key. Think of it less like a single website and more like a loose network, almost an ecosystem of online communities.
Okay.
You've got forums, blogs, certain subreddits, YouTube channels, social media groups, all talking about men's experiences, perspectives on dating, masculinity, that kind of thing.
And the content, as we noted, it really varies, doesn't it?
Hugely. You can find genuinely useful advice, sometimes career, fitness, social skills. But you also find communities promoting really radical, sometimes quite toxic ideologies. It's a broad spectrum.
You absolutely have to keep that spectrum in mind.
For sure.
And the sources mention specific subcultures, like MGTOW, men going their own way, and PUAs, pickup artists.
Yeah, those are two distinct examples within the broader manosphere.
Can you give us a quick rundown on them? What's the difference?
Sure. So MGTAW, men going their own way, is basically a philosophy where men choose to disengage to varying degrees from serious relationships or marriage with women.
Why? What's the thinking there?
Often it stems from a belief that society, or maybe the legal system, is biased against men, especially in relationships or divorce. So they advocate for male self-preservation and independence from women.
Okay, and PUAs, pickup artists. That sounds quite different.
Very different focus. PUAs are all about learning techniques and strategies specifically to, well, attract women, usually for short-term relationships or sex. It's more about mastering social dynamics for romantic success.
Got it. So different goals, different philosophies, but both kind of orbiting these themes of gender and relationships from a male perspective.
Exactly. They're part of that larger conversation, even if they disagree on specifics.
And where did all this start? The sources pointed towards the early 2000s.
Yeah, the early 2000s seemed to be the key formative period. The internet was really taking off with forums and blogs, creating spaces for these discussions.
Were there key figures or moments that kicked things off?
Well, you had figures like Neil Strauss, whose book The Game kind of brought PUA culture into the mainstream spotlight,
Right, I remember that book.
and bloggers like Rush Fabif, who became known for some pretty controversial views on dating and gender roles. These figures and the platforms they used helped galvanize these early communities.
And over time, it sort of fractured or evolved?
It evolved into different factions, definitely. Some stayed focused on, say, building confidence or social skills, while others became much more explicitly about reacting against feminism, what they saw as its negative effects.
Okay, that really sets the stage. So let's
Yeah.
dive into the language now. Red pill. It's probably the most iconic term, right?
These are certainly one of the most pervasive and symbolic.
Comes from the Matrix, obviously.
Take it.
Take the red pill, see the harsh reality.
Exactly that. In the manosphere context, taking the red pill means rejecting what they see as mainstream, often feminist-influenced narratives about gender, dating, society.
So it's like an awakening, seeing the truth.
That's how it's framed. An awakening to supposedly fundamental, sometimes uncomfortable truths about how men and women really are, how society really works, often in ways they believe disadvantage men. Seeing behind the sort of societal illusions.
But that phrase, seeing the truth, it feels like it could mean very different things. I mean, the sources showed it being used for self-awareness, but also...
Also to justify some really extreme anti-woman sentiment.
Yes.
Yes, that's the crucial ambiguity.
Right.
For some, the red pill might genuinely represent a moment of questioning societal norms, maybe reevaluating their own experiences. But for others, it's become a dog whistle, a shorthand for a whole suite of anti-feminist beliefs, sometimes bordering on outright hostility.
So the same term carries vastly different weight depending on who's using it and how.
Precisely. And that causes a lot of confusion and conflict around the term itself.
Yeah, I can see that. Which kind of leads us naturally to the next big term, misogyny. Basic definition. Hatred or prejudice against women. How does this accusation play out in the manosphere?
Well, the criticism leveled against many parts of the manosphere is that they normalize or even actively promote misogyny,
Hustle.
often by consistently portraying women in negative ways as manipulative, hypergamous, meaning they only seek higher status partners, irrational, inferior, you name it. Critics argue this constant negativity fuels a toxic environment.
And can spill over offline.
That's the major concern, yes. That it contributes to online harassment, justifies discrimination, or worse.
But the sources also mentioned a counter-argument from within these groups.
Yeah.
This idea that they're not hateful, they're just telling uncomfortable truths.
Right. That's a common defense. Some proponents argue they're simply observing and discussing patterns of behavior or societal dynamics that mainstream culture ignores or deliberately suppresses.
So they'd say it's realism, not hatred.
They might frame it that way, yes. They might say they're highlighting perceived biological or social differences or negative experiences they've had and framing it as necessary truth-telling, however uncomfortable.
But where's the line? That feels like a dangerous justification.
It's incredibly blurry and, yes, potentially dangerous. Critics argue that framing misogynistic stereotypes as uncomfortable truths is a way to legitimize prejudice and shield it from criticism. It can easily become an excuse for hostility.
A really crucial distinction to grasp. Okay, let's unpack another pair of terms. Alpha male and beta male. These feel like they've almost gone mainstream sometimes.
They definitely have wider cultural recognition now, yeah.
Where did they even come from? The sources mentioned wolf packs.
Originally, yes. The concept came from some early studies of wolf packs in captivity, where researchers observed a perceived hierarchy with a dominant alpha pair leading the group.
Ah, okay.
Alphas were seen as the leaders, the most assertive, while betas were more submissive followers.
But didn't the sources say that science is kind of shaky now?
Very shaky. Later research, especially on wolves in the wild, largely debunked the idea of a rigid, linear alpha hierarchy like that. Even the original researcher has tried to correct the record. Applying it directly to human social dynamics is, scientifically speaking, pretty flawed.
So, bad science, basically. But the terms stuck online, how are they used in the manosphere?
They've been adopted as, well, a kind of social categorization. The alpha male is held up as the ideal. Confident, dominant, successful, especially with women, commands respect.
The guy everyone wants to be.
Essentially, yes, within that framework. And the beta male is the opposite, seen as passive, weak, maybe a nice guy who finishes last, unsuccessful in attracting partners or asserting himself.
And men use these terms to judge themselves and others.
Absolutely. It's used for self-assessment. Am I alpha enough? And definitely for categorizing and often criticizing other men's behavior.
And again, like Red Pill, it sounds like it can be used in different ways, maybe motivation for some, but potentially toxic for others.
Exactly the same pattern. Some might use the alpha idea as motivation. I need to be more confident, more assertive, trying to improve themselves. But the major criticism is that it's incredibly reductive and often promotes a very narrow, sometimes aggressive version of masculinity. It can make men feel inadequate if they don't fit the alpha mold and foster unhealthy comparisons.
Yeah, creating pressure and judgment. Okay, one more term in this section, incels. This one feels particularly heavy, often linked to tragic news stories.
It is. It's a term that carries a lot of negative weight now.
What does it actually stand for?
It's short for involuntary celibate.
And the core idea.
The core belief is that they are unable to find romantic or sexual partners despite wanting them. Crucially, this lack of success is typically blamed externally on women's choices, societal standards, genetics, things they feel outside their control.
So a sense of frustration, resentment.
Deep frustration, often profound loneliness and resentment, yeah. A feeling of being excluded from something fundamental.
And the sources suggested, like other groups, it's not monolithic, there's a spectrum.
That's really important to understand. Yes, there's a spectrum. Some online spaces for incels might genuinely be focused on seeking mutual support, sharing feelings of isolation, maybe trying to find ways to cope or improve their situation.
But there's a darker side.
There's a much darker, more extreme side. These factions often express intense misogyny, believing women owe them sex, and harbor extreme resentment towards sexually active men, often called chads, and women, Stacys.
And this is where it gets really dangerous.
Yes. In the most extreme cases, this has escalated into ideologies that justify or even glorify violence against women or society at large.
Which explains why platforms have cracked down, the bans mentioned in the sources.
Exactly. Because of the association with real-world violence and the promotion of violent hate speech, many major platforms like Reddit have banned incel-specific communities to try and curb the spread of these dangerous extremist views.
Okay, so clearly these aren't just words or abstract ideas online. Let's talk about the real-world implications. These online conversations shape offline attitudes, right?
Absolutely. There's a definite feedback loop. Online ideologies influence real-world beliefs and behaviors, and real-world experiences can drive people to seek out these online communities. What happens online doesn't just stay online.
The sources raise an interesting point that for some men, maybe feeling lost or lonely, the manosphere might actually feel welcoming, like it provides answers.
It can seem that way, unfortunately. For men struggling with loneliness, social anxiety, rejection, or just confusion about modern dating or masculinity, these communities can offer a sense of belonging.
A place where they feel understood.
Yes, a sense of community, shared vocabulary, and often very simplistic explanations for complex problems. It can feel validating initially to find others expressing similar frustrations.
But the flip side, the major concern, is radicalization, especially for vulnerable men.
That's the critical danger highlighted by critics. These spaces can act as echo chambers, amplifying negative or extreme viewpoints. If someone is already feeling isolated or resentful, being immersed in constant misogyny or anti-society rhetoric can push them further down a radical path.
Hardening their views, potentially leading to harmful actions.
That's the fear, and there have been instances linked to these ideologies.
Which brings us back to that core tension you mentioned earlier. Is the manosphere ultimately about, say, empowerment for men feeling left behind? Or is it more about perpetuating hate?
That really is the crux of the debate, isn't it? It's complex. You might find elements aimed at genuine self-improvement or addressing legitimate issues men face.
Like mental health or societal expectations?
Potentially, yes. But those elements often exist alongside or are drowned out by significant amounts of misogyny, hostility, and sometimes outright dangerous ideologies. So judging its overall impact is incredibly difficult. Is the empowerment built on a harmful foundation?
That's the tough question. So for everyone listening, having heard this breakdown, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, we'd genuinely be interested.
Do you see the manosphere as maybe a necessary, if flawed, outlet for certain male concerns? Or does it fundamentally cross the line into being harmful?
There's no single easy answer, clearly. Think about whether these spaces offer real solutions or mostly just reinforce negativity and division.
We hope this deep dive has at least given you a clear picture, a better vocabulary to understand this complex online world.
Yeah, hopefully a solid foundation for thinking about it critically. It's definitely an ongoing, evolving phenomenon.
Definitely. And maybe we can leave you with one final thought to chew on.
Yeah.
What responsibility do individuals and maybe the online platforms themselves have here?
Right. How do we balance addressing potentially legitimate male concerns or feelings of alienation while also strongly pushing back against the hate and harm that can fester in these same spaces?
A tricky balance indeed. Thanks for diving deep with us today.